Right, and we resolved it. So I think you guys make some really good points. I think we can see both of those things in our culture, right? We're not completely idealists or completely pragmatists, right? And this is true of all people and all times, but we also, and so I think the way we see this quite often is that we do love things ideally, absolutely, right? We love the idea of everyone like love. Love's pretty universal. People are like, yay, love. Love is good, right? Courage, honesty. We think pretty universally, if everybody manifested these things, the world would be a better place. So in that way, we are idealists. But we also understand in our country that any time that I say something is right, that necessarily means that something also is wrong. And so if I say, you should do this thing, all people should do this thing, rape is bad, right? Don't do this thing, right? Then that takes that off the board, right? We say, don't eat pizza on Tuesday mornings. I don't know why you do that. It's an excellent time to eat pizza, right? But that means that you're limiting your self-expression, right? You're limiting the ability to be what you want to be when you want to be by saying something is right. And therefore something is wrong. And so this is what we call, the more philosophers would call the pragmatic versus the idealist dichotomy. And it's asking what the best way to live life is. And as we continue in our series this week, Jesus is the Worst, where we look at the final days of Jesus' life and the characters that judged Jesus and condemned him to death, we are going to meet a master pragmatist today named Pontius Pilate. And he believes in authority and structure and organization. He has some of those ideals, like we do in our culture, but he ultimately sides often dealing with a pluralistic, globalized, modern culture, which is what Rome was, with what works. His practicality coupled with progress was his goal. And we'll see him respond to a number of different truth claims throughout our text today, and he responds to truth in, I'm going to argue, 3 different ways, and we're going to see it responded to in 4 ways. 1, we can deny truth. 2, we can compromise truth. 3, we can condemn truth. Or 4, we can be condemned by or be changed by truth. And it's our job today for us to consider what role truth is going to play in our lives as either idealists or pragmatists. Okay? Let's go ahead and take a minute and pray. Lord, thank you that we can be gathered here in your house today, Lord, that you've taken up residence in our hearts, and that we get to gather as a body in your name, in the name of Jesus Christ, Lord, because of what you did for us. You came and you lived, and you lived the sinless life that we could not live, and you died in our place so that we could be forgiven of those sins and have the opportunity to know that you are the truth. You are the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one gets to the Father except through you, and that we can, through trusting you, come to faith, Lord, and that we as a community today need to hear from you. We need to hear what you have to say for us, Lord, to grow our hearts, to grow our courage, to know how to respond to a world that often doesn't understand us, and if we're honest, to know how to respond to you when we don't often understand ourselves. Lord, please help us to hear from you and see you today and know you better as we leave this place so that we may be your hands and feet to the communities around us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so Pontius Pilate, in a lot of ways, was an ambassador of the first globalized culture, that is Greece and Rome, right? It spread much like Western culture has spread via technology. For us, it's the internet and media. For them, it was the road. That was a new, exciting thing at the time, although there was other inventions, the nautical and militaristic and technological developments that helped Rome reach new regions of the world and keep them as a conglomerate together. So Pilate, as present as he was in his role in Israel, was a bearer of Roman ethics and politics and religion and culture. Yet, his idealism about Rome had to be limited by the practical situation he found himself in. And so just to give you some background on who Pontius Pilate was, and what's sitting behind our text today, you should understand that Pontius Pilate was a military man. He's what we'd call a prefect, and that's not just house leaders in Harry Potter. Like, a prefect is someone who was noted by Rome and had probably some military background to rule a lesser province, some province that's less important in the world of Roman politics. Judea was one of those provinces. Generally, you'd see aristocrats that would rule, and generally prefects would rule small portions of these aristocrats' region. But Pontius, because this was a really unimportant region, just ruled it on his own. It didn't belong to some larger conglomerate. So he was the guy in the region. He ruled between 26 and 36 AD under Caesar Tiberius Caesar, who was himself a pretty practical guy, not a well-beloved guy, but did, when he died, left Rome's borders very secure, left a strong treasury, left a strong military, and made decisions based upon what needed to happen so that Rome could succeed. But Pilate was not Tiberius. He had made a lot of not so popular decisions. So by the time that we reach this trial, what you should understand is that Pilate, feeling very confident about his Roman ideals, when he first came to Jerusalem in 26 AD, rolls in at night. And why does he roll in at night? Now, we don't for sure know what his motives for rolling in at night, but we have two Roman historians who tell us about these events, Josephus and Philo, and they tell us that Jerusalem had been this hotbed of conflict for hundreds of years, ever since Alexander the Great rolled in, and then it was a part of the Seleucid Empire, and then the Ptolemy Empire. It's not actually what it's called, but the general Ptolemy's region. And then there was this weakness in the region for a while, and there was this thing called the Maccabean Revolt, and this Hasmonean, what they were called, the Hasmonean dynasty started. This was Israel kind of hollowed out their own pocket for themselves and actually had about 100 years of independence, and then Rome's invited back in, and they have to crush this thing. And to be honest, it's been this hotbed of activity for a long time, and it's even warring with Rome for several decades in the last 50 or 60 years. And so we've only had a relatively short period of peace in Jerusalem. And one of the things that the predecessors to Pilate did was try to respect Jewish tradition, right? One of that being, we don't have any graven images of foreign deities. Caesar, often being presented as divine, represented one of these characters. And so what the Roman government before had allowed them to do is not have any banners or shields, things like that with Rome's crests and Rome's seals and pictures of Caesar on it, because these were sort of a corruption of God's holy city, right? What Pontius Pilate does, though, is says, no, I'm going to establish my power. He shows up at night, and when all the Jewish population wakes up in the morning, what do they find? Banners of Caesar everywhere, okay? He has shown that Rome is here and here to stay. What he doesn't expect, though, is that then the population rallies around his palace. They don't threaten him, but they protest. They protest, they protest, they protest. And they protest, they stay there for 5 whole days. All right? And Pilate is getting really ticked off about this, so what he decides he's going to do is he lines up soldiers, brings them out there, and says, all right, I'm going to tell you what. Anybody who's not dead, who's not gone, in 10 minutes is going to die. I don't know if he said 10 minutes. But he told them to leave, all right? And they stretch out their necks and lay on the ground. And they say, it'd be better for us to die than to desecrate God's city. And he says, well, I probably shouldn't start off my rule in Jerusalem by murdering a good chunk of the population. So he backs off, he takes the banners down, but now he feels weak, right? Now he feels weak. And so it's not too long later when he decides he's going to try something new. He decides to hang all these gold shields all around the area. And he dedicates them to Caesar. Now, they don't have any crests on them or anything. There might have been a small inscription on them. But the idea was that he was just doing this to annoy the population, being like, okay, I can't do that, but look what I can do. It was the little brother, like, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. All right? This was Pontius Pilate's approach to the people of Jerusalem. He won't take them down. They complain. He won't take them down. They complain. And they actually recruit Herod Antipas at this point. He sends a note to Tiberius. Tiberius sends a note back. Pilate, quit being an idiot. all right? You're being dumb. You're messing with the population you're sent to rule. You are not being helpful. Knock it off. Okay? So now he's shamed by his own government. All right? He tries to figure out other ways to get them, and shortly after that, he decides, okay, I can't put up any images. Here's what I'm going to do. He goes into the temple in Jerusalem, takes the treasury, and decides to fund a Roman aqueduct with all the money that had been donated to the temple treasury. Okay? So by the time we get to this instance, Pilate is probably one of the most unpopular people, both in the Jewish eyes of the population, Jewish population's eyes, and the Roman government's eyes. Nobody likes this guy. And he realizes, I am just a hair's breadth away from losing my position, from losing my authority, from losing my power. So, what should I do? And this leads us to the very first part of our text here, verse 28, John 18, verse 28. And we read, Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. Pilate said, Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus said about the kind of death he was going to die. Now, this is Pilate's new, tolerant, idealist approach, right? His, new tolerant, pragmatic approach to the idealists that he's dealing with, represented by the priests and the Jewish leadership there that have some authority, and they know they've got Pilate here, all right? But they know Pilate's not popular, but Pilate tries to be well-mannered and maintain himself and figure out what he has to do. Now you'll notice they don't go into him. They go and wait outside. Why? Because they didn't want to become unclean. All right? So I'm sure this is not lost on Pilate. All right? Imagine someone coming to your house and going, hi, I need to talk to you. Can you come outside? Oh, no, you can just come in. I've got a living room. Yeah, no, we're going to need to come outside. Why? Because you're dirty. Because you're dirty and I don't want to touch your dirty stuff. Right? Well, that's pretty offensive. That you don't want to come into my dirty home and touch my dirty stuff. But okay, all right. So he comes out to them. Now, just to be clear, there was actually no law against going into a Gentile's house. Okay? There's a similar thing that happens in Acts 10 where the Apostle Peter receives a vision about going into a Gentile's house and he has a really hard time with it. And we need to understand is there's not actually a law in the Old Testament that's done this. But just like we talked about last week with the Pharisees, what we've seen is these other laws that have developed that put what we call fences around the Torah, right? We know we're not supposed to commit idolatry. We're not supposed to become ritually unclean. So, what's the best way to avoid that? Not get ourselves anywhere close to it, okay? So the idea was that if you went into a Gentile's house, you could potentially be exposed to unclean things, unclean foods, unclean situations, and it's just better not to enter, right? But it had become such an ideal that now no one would enter even into a Gentile's home because the thought was automatically you become ceremonial unclean, all right? So they're judging a lot. He's feeling a lot of judgment, and he comes out and says, fine. What charges are you bringing against this man? And they give no respect again. They just said, look, we've already judged him. If he wasn't guilty, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Just do what we want. And Pilate, deep breath, patient man goes, okay, then you can judge him by your own law, which of course he knows they can't do. And they admit, okay, look, we can't kill anybody, as if to say, okay, well, what are the charges again then? And apparently they did reveal the charges, because then we get this interesting little conversation between Jesus and Pilate. So, idealism 0, pragmatism 1, all right? Pilate winning, all right? This is what's happened in our first section. We move on to verse 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea? Jesus asked, or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate replied. Are your own people and chief priests handed you over to me? What is it that you've done? Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," Pilate said. Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate retorted. With this, he went on again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for charges against this man." So, Pilate approaches Jesus the same way he approaches the other Pharisees and Sadducees outside. He sticks to the facts, he follows the rules, the legal proceedings, he's very pragmatic about it. And he begins to ask, as any criminal, how do you plead? What's the charge? How do you plead? They said, "You're the king of the Jews." "Are you the king of the Jews?" And we should understand that this was primarily a political title. When Pilate says it, when Herod says it, Herod the Great, about 50 years earlier, had taken that title upon himself. When he became the ruler in Jerusalem, under Rome, he took on the moniker, the King of the Jews, right? This is why he gets so upset when the wise men come to him and say, "Hey, we found the King of the Jews." He goes, "I'm the King of the Jews. That's not okay. We got to kill that guy." All right? So when Pilate hears this, he's saying, they're accusing you of being a political enemy, right? Of someone who's here to stir up opposition to Rome. And one would expect a defense from Jesus, but he doesn't give one. He just says, "Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me?" And this should give us insight into Jesus' way of thinking. He is, at least on some level, an idealist, and he's just trying to establish, what does Pilate already think? You see, throughout the Gospels, there's plenty of examples of people coming to Jesus and asking questions, sometimes about teaching, asking for healing, asking what Jesus is going to do, and quite often, and they come with various different motivations. Sometimes they're trying to out and out trap Jesus, get him to do something stupid so they can arrest him. Sometimes they are genuinely seeking help or understanding. And this is what Jesus is doing. He's saying, "I know you're asking me all these questions, but I can't answer the questions unless I know who you think you're talking to." Okay? And Pilate answers pretty clearly, "I have no idea who you are or what you've done. I'm not a Jew, nor do I concern myself with your people. This is simply part of my pragmatic role. I'm just doing what I have to. I would prefer to be eating breakfast." Okay? It's not what I choose for myself. And once this is established, we see Jesus taking a step back, and now he answers both of Pilate's questions at once. Both, "What have you done?" and "Are you the king of the Jews?" He says, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to this truth. Everyone on the side of the truth listens to me." So he answers that he is a king, that his kingdom is of a different world, though, and that therefore he's not a political enemy. He's there as an ambassador. He's like Pilate. He's an emissary of a foreign culture, representing a different kingdom, a different way of life, and a different grasp of truth. Both men are claiming to represent a kingdom with real power, but where Pilate claims to represent Roman pragmatism, Jesus claims to represent this new version of truth. And for Pilate, this represents the first time his pragmatism comes up against Jesus' claims of truth, and his response is to deny it. For Pilate, like for many people today, truth is a relative term. It can't be known absolutely, and so then absolute truth claims are sort of taken with a grain of salt. There are more opinions than fact. And what we need to realize is that Pilate, very much like us, lived in a polytheistic culture. What this means is he grew up in a culture that worshipped many different gods. And there are variations of worship. If you wanted to worship the god of fertility, you would go to Aphrodite's temple and partake in relations as appropriate for that worship. If you wanted to worship wine, you could go worship Dionysus and drink wine. If you wanted to worship music, you could go worship Apollo. If you wanted to worship the merchants and the god of merchants and goods and economy, you'd go worship Mercury, right? And so this is actually more like our world than we think. Now, we don't formally go to a temple, but if we want to worship Aphrodite, we might go to a website, right? Or, and we don't go to a temple to worship Dionysus, but we do go to a bar, right? We don't go to, and I'm not saying that everyone who enters a bar is worshiping Dionysus, but this is a form of temple. It's where we go to find this engagement and fulfilling, for some people, engagement and fulfillment in a certain way. We don't go to a temple to worship Apollo, but we might go to YouTube or Spotify. And we don't go to a temple to worship gods of commerce, but we might go to Amazon or the mall. And the thing is, we're not all that different from the people of both Rome and Jerusalem in this way, because all people worship. Like, this is just the truth. All people worship, and they worship by giving themselves to things. And this is what I mean by my examples before. We go to the places where we believe joy and purpose and passion can be found, right? We pursue the ends we think will really meet us where our heart's need is. And so in a culture that values pragmatism above all else, even religion becomes yet just another pragmatic place that people go to find fulfillment. I've heard a lot of people tell me that over the years, that like sort of religion it's a nice thing, you know? I heard it in a sitcom last night. A guy described religion as Paul Rudd. He sees the appeal, he can appreciate it, but he'd never stand in line for it. That was the idea, right? The idea that there's some things that were like, this is fun, I can see why people are into this, it's just not my thing, right? That's the approach that a lot of people take. But the problem, the thing is, once again, that the goal of that system is functionality. It's not truth, but it's just whatever functions in our system. What works for you, works for you, works for you, you do you, it'll be fine. However, what Pilate soon finds out is this often doesn't solve the problem. While it allows for individuals to express themselves as we might wish in a given scenario, it doesn't allow for a basis of government, it doesn't allow for a system by which people can judge one another or come to any sort of standards, any sort of moral standards. And this leads to Pilate's second approach to truth, which is what we call compromising truth. And we read, with this he went out again to the Jews and gathered there and said, I find no basis for charges against this man. Yet the people don't accept this judgment, and so when truth is not primary, that is, the truth was Christ was innocent according to Roman law, the next question becomes, what are some pragmatic solutions to satisfy both the law and free Jesus? And now we read three short accounts of Pilate's attempts at pragmatic compromises with truth. And I won't read through them all, but in verse 39 we get the first one. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? They shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. And what we learn is that this is an example where this is not somebody they were requesting. This is someone that Barabbas, Pilate had said, okay, what can I do? Jesus is clearly no threat. They are clearly accusing him falsely and want him dead. What could I do? I'm going to offer them someone instead that is so bad, no one could ever want them on the streets. And then saying, who would you rather have on the streets near your families, near your children? This guy who's in trouble for healing people, or this guy who's in trouble for political insurrection, for murder, for theft? This guy who's been a threat to our city and our culture and our people. You choose. Who do you want free on the streets? And they say, this guy. Because their idealist motivations are driving them so deeply that he doesn't understand this idealist mindset that said, he blasphemed. This is the guy that they want Jesus dead. So we know that he was a murderer. We know that he was all these things that would terrify most people to have on the streets with their children. And yet they still cry for his blood. And so he said, okay, that didn't work. I've released Barabbas and I still have Jesus. Shoot. That really backfired. What am I going to do now? So we read in chapter 19, said that Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went to him again and again. And went up to him again and again, hail, King of the Jews. And they slapped him in the face. So this is the he's already been punished enough approach, right? We know he's innocent, but maybe if I present Jesus to them as having been abused deeply enough, their bloodlust will be satiated, right? He was trying to get them to just be satisfied with the pain they wanted Jesus to feel. He was trying to give them enough where it would be enough and he could just let the whole thing go. Just pretend it's fine. But it doesn't work. lastly, we read, once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you and let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." This is the humiliation approach, right? He takes a man claiming to be king, dresses him up in mock finery, bloodied and beaten, alone, and basically asks them, "What is the threat? What are you so worried about?" And here's the thing. Pilate's trying to address the fact that we know truth is limiting, right? He's trying to give everybody what they want, but he knows that it's not working. It's not happening. He knows, just like I talked about earlier, that there's this personal level of loss. If I say yes to getting a nap, to getting up, then I can't be asleep. If I say yes to dinner, then I can't be hungry 5 minutes after. Our statements, when made, absolutely limit the breadth of self-expression, both in us and in others, and this necessarily means that if we want everyone to agree on truth, it has to be compromised. Pilate has a belief about Jesus, and so he tries to package that belief differently. If the goal is to save Jesus, but likewise not to ruffle any feathers, then compromise is necessary, but truth is lost. Even though he confesses 3 times that Jesus is innocent, his practicality doesn't allow him. He packages Jesus just as not another bad guy, having been punished enough, and a poor and weak king. And we have to be careful not to do the same. Too often, when we approach Jesus, either in our own lives, we don't take our own sin and our own issues seriously enough. And I'll be the first one to raise my hand and say, I do this. Sometimes I sin boldly in God's face because I don't take the blood of Christ seriously. Because I treat the cross as a crutch for me. It allows me to do what I want instead of trusting that God's delivered me from a life of sin and shame. But the truth is, we treat Jesus this way with other people too. We try to package him as like, oh no, you should become a Christian because like Jesus is great and your life will turn around and maybe you'll get rich and like you'll finally find that person you've been looking for that's going to make you happy and the world will be great. But the problem is, it's not what the Bible says, ever. Ever. Right? I can't even guarantee that if you come to the Lord in your pain and in your suffering, that it's all just going to go away. In fact, far more likely I find that the road, and when I talk with older Christians, and this has been my experience too, the longer I walk with the Lord, the more I see how absolutely weak I am. How I can't do anything. You know? I can't just grow this church with charm and charisma. I can't just fix relationships and make it easy. I can't just communicate all the way I want to all the time. I can't just be the kind of guy I want to be, but I believe that Jesus is with me, and that's actually the point. That I'm both sinful and yet I am forgiven and I am loved, and Christ wants me to meet me in the moment. To meet me in the grossness. I was watching a video the other day, and this guy was talking about how he had this vision. He was heavily addicted to pornography and had had several affairs, and his wife was leaving him, and he had this vision where he's I forget where he actually was, but he saw himself walking through prison with his plate, and nobody would let him sit at the table. And he went, and he sat down at a table by himself, and he notices somebody coming up, and he looks up, and it's Jesus, dressed like him as an inmate. And Jesus sits down with him, and he, feeling this guilt of continually living in sin, even though he's a pastor, and he's supposed to love Jesus, and he's just living in these sinful, terrible cycles. And he says, will you still share a meal with me? And Jesus says, I'll share a meal with you anytime you want. And he's like, but you should also know that the door's open. You don't have to stay here. If you stay here, I'll still be here with you, but you don't have to stay here. And I think a lot of the time we compromise on who Jesus is, but when we compromise on who Jesus is, we lose the message of Christ's forgiveness, of Christ's faithfulness to us, of his love, and the redemption he actually does want to bring for our lives, but often not in the way we anticipate. Lastly, we see Pilate's only response he has left, and that is to condemn truth. We read in verse 7, the Jewish leaders instead insisted, we have no law, we have a law, and according to that law he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have the power to either free you or crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend to Caesar. Anyone who claims to be king opposes Caesar. And we jump ahead. He asks, shall I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. In the last scene, we see a flip in the crowd, and maybe this is good for us. The staunch idealism of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, where they stated so strongly, this is why he has to die, according to our religion, turns to pragmatism. It's flipped. Well, what's really going to get him condemned is him being an enemy of Caesar. So we have no king but Caesar. Whatever we have to say to get our way. And Pilate doesn't have any pragmatism left, and he trades it back for ideals. But he's innocent. He hasn't done anything. And the moment has come. You have to make a decision when there's no way out left. What are you going to do? Pilate's solution is to just say, this isn't of me. In another gospel, we're told that he actually brings out water and washes his hand in front of the crowd and said, I wash my hands of this. Saying, I'm not guilty of this. If you want to kill him, but I'm not guilty of it. And yet, even though Pilate says that and thinks that and wants that to be true, that last line, he handed Jesus over to be crucified. In the end, simply, he ignored truth. This Jesus who says he was the way and the truth and the life, and actually embodied the truth of another kingdom, a true kingdom, a higher kingdom, a better kingdom, a kingdom where love and relationship and power and justice were actually united. Jesus was showing what that kingdom actually looked like, a kingdom that didn't represent the power Pilate was used to, and that scared Pilate greatly. It scared him to the point where he knew that his kingdom was crumbling in front of his eyes, and he had to compromise truth. He had to ignore truth, and he had to deny truth if he was going to keep it. In our culture, we love to talk about having an open mind. We often present pragmatism and open-mindedness to be synonymous. If nothing is held absolutely, then there's no reason for conflict. However, I once heard an apologist say that an open mind is like an open mouth, useless unless it closes upon something solid. And this has always stuck with me, as an open mind is presumably ready to receive that which is nourishing and healthy, and if it's not, to spit it out. The purpose is not, however, to never take anything in, to be continually open, or simply to taste a wide variety of options. One must be nourished, and the only way to do that is to take in food, to consume it, to know it intimately in you. In this way, truth is necessary, and pragmatism, while not bad, when used as an end and not a means, when it's used not as a tool, but as the foundation, it can be a conduit of both good and evil. Saying something is practical is not actually a defense for it. Practicality is amoral, not immoral, but amoral. That is, without moral merit. It may be practical to help an old woman cross the road. You'll feel good about yourself. It'll make society a better place. It may also be practical to cheat on a test because you didn't have time to study. It may be practical to cheat on your wife because it's easier than dealing with your issues. It was practical for Hitler to execute the Jewish workers he had left at the end of World War II, even though the war was lost because it tied up loose ends. It was practical to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to stop American lives being lost. If there is no absolute behind practicality, then the truth can be condemned as easily as anything else. A casualty of felt need. There's a novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky where one of the characters said, if God does not exist, then everything is permissible. What he understood was that if there are no absolutes behind your practicality, then there's no absolute intention for your life or for your nation or for your technology. And if there's no intention, then there is no right and wrong. As Voldemort said, there is only power. Sorry, I don't usually do 2 Harry Potter references in one sermon. That's weird, but it just worked. Pilate, when left without absolutes, was forced to simply what worked best for him in the moment. For his position, for his city, for himself, and that was to commit murder, to condemn an innocent man, and to abolish truth. Pilate's Jewish counterparts in this scene remind us that to believe so strongly in your ideals that you fail to see your hypocrisy profits no one. And so we see in this both that idealism is not the answer and pragmatism is not the answer. And yet, you see, when Jesus went to the cross, we learned several things. He continues his claims to Pilate that he is a king, that he has a real army of angels waiting for him who would fight for him, but he doesn't summon them. That he has ideals that he believes to be absolute, and not just for him, but for everybody. And yet he's also practical. What Pilate would not allow himself to see was that he was in fact guilty along with the crowd. Jesus saw this too, and yet his response was not one of condemnation or self-protection. He prayed, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. His practicality, being rooted in something that was absolute, allowed love and relationship and justice to live. Those took him to a place of suffering, took him to a place of abandonment and pain and death, because that's what he had to do. But here's the thing about truth, and here's the thing about Jesus that we need to wrestle with today. Truth lets itself be condemned because it knows it is fixed and cannot eternally die. Truth recognizes that it will suffer because in a fallen world we hate things that interrupt our ability to worship self. Yet truth also recognizes that in that suffering and dying, in that pain and anguish, its immorality and ability to offer hope to those who have none will become apparent. So, this is the practical idealism of Jesus Christ. Today, as we consider this dichotomy in our lives, as Christians, I want to ask you who you are in Jesus. Because if you know who you are in Jesus, that changes everything. The call to follow Jesus after that is not about the rules, the right rules, being the right kind of person, but it is about pragmatically saying, who is Jesus and who am I? And what is Jesus calling me to do today? Because I believe that if I follow him and love him and obey him, my heart actually is met more by him. There's actually a contentment and a joy and a hope to be discovered in faith that is not discovered in any of those other places we go to worship. There are no other ideals. There are no other practicalities when taken apart from Jesus that ultimately satisfy our hope, our sinfulness,